You're now listening to DurianASEAN, the voice of discovery and sharing.
Monday Morning Matters.
Perspectives
from Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene and you're listening to DurianASEAN, the voice of discovery and sharing. Today on our Monday Morning Matters, we will discuss on Malaysia's economy. As we all know, Malaysia's economy, and including the regional economy, is not doing very well, and there are some external and internal factors that is contributing to the Malaysia's economic spiral. With me is JMenon. He's the lead economist of Trade and Regional Cooperation with the ASEAN, with the Asian Development Bank. So first of all, hi and welcome.
Hi Arlene, good morning to you and your listeners.
Before we kickstart our discussion on Malaysia's economy, perhaps a bit of an overview from what we see right now with the global economy and how it is affecting the regional and especially with Malaysia.
Right, sure. I guess one thing that's very clear now is that the China slowdown is having, the first thing, the China slowdown is real. Mm-hmm. We know that it's significant. We're still a bit unclear about the true depth of the slowdown, but there are indirect indicators that suggest that it's worse than the reported official numbers are portraying. So it's a real slowdown that we're concerned about. That's the first impact. The second is that slowdown, however slow that might be, is having a bigger than expected impact on the region. Mm-hmm. The early signs of that are already evident that it's having a much bigger impact. Mm-hmm. So both factors suggest that the news might be more negative rather than positive going forward.
And the region in Southeast Asia, and especially Malaysia, we have been relying a lot with China on trade, and part of the slowdown is the slow in export. From the China side, why there's a global slowdown and why it's attributed to China?
Okay, so China, I guess, is going through a number of structural sort of adjustments internally as well. It's becoming less trade-oriented by design. It wants to shift the sources of demand or growth, if you like, from external to domestic. That is by design. It sees itself as being too heavily trade-dependent, and so it wants to reduce that. So that's one factor. The second one is that, there's been, China's been growing at a very fast rate for a very long time.
Yep.
And this could not continue indefinitely, right? So sooner or later, it would have to slow a little bit. Even now, the growth rate is very healthy, but it's slowing compared to a very high rate of growth for a long time. So this is basically coming back to a more sustainable level of growth, if you like. Since we got so used to a very fast-growing China, we are feeling the impact of even a small slowdown.
I see. And this was expected by countries in this region that, one day China will not be as active as before when it comes to trade.
Yes, people always expected that, but they never wanted it to actually happen. And China is so big that there's not that much you can do. It's the largest trading country in the world, and it's linked in with the regional supply chain, the value chain in the region itself. So sooner or later, you couldn't really prepare too much for the slowdown. It was going to have an impact on you, whatever you tried to do, because when you've got a huge trading partner like China, you can't diversify away that risk. It's going to bite one way or the other.
And another slowdown that is still quite a problem to Malaysia is the continuous falling of oil prices or oil demand. Do you foresee this going to be for a longer period?
It's difficult to imagine that this will be, a short-run phenomenon. Right now, it looks like oil prices have adjusted to a lower equilibrium level. Again, they were very high before and for quite a long time. I mean, I'm not an expert on forecasting oil prices. I don't think there are many experts really who can do that. But it does seem like there's not going to be a return to, the 100+ prices for quite some time yet. So I think we have to get used to prices around this range for quite a while.
And because of that, what we are seeing for the next year's budget 2016 is government have already cushioned the country's GDP coffer by introducing taxes like GST to somehow replace a partial of the oil revenue that we used to enjoy. Do you think this is something that is good for Malaysia to survive the economic regression in the coming years?
Right, yes. I guess, the GST is certainly going to be a buffer when it comes to replacing some of the lost revenues from oil, the drop in oil prices, although the GST has been on the cards for a while now. So I guess it's just a happy coincidence that this has, come at a time when Malaysia has had to look to replenish its coffers, as you say. So I don't know if this was planned that well.
It wasn't. I thought it was planned because of.
I think they plan to broaden the tax base, and that's a good thing for moving the incidence of taxation to a broad-based consumption source. But as you know, I mean, consumption taxes are a bit regressive in the sense that the poor or the lower income groups tend to pay a disproportionately higher share of the total because they actually spend a lot more of the income than higher income people who save a lot more and so are not subject to as much of a burden as a proportion of their total income. So it's not the most fair tax, but it's certainly a highly efficient tax, and also it's one that's quite inelastic in the sense that it doesn't fall sharply when growth slows down. The simple reason for that is we continue having to consume a minimum amount of food and clothing and all these essential items, whatever happens to the economy. So it's quite a resilient source of revenue raising for the government, and it'll be very handy, I think, in light of this massive drop in oil prices.
So I guess the government is trying to be more pragmatic with the way it generates its income. But at the same time, there's a Khazanah research. They found out that when it comes to when you mentioned about people who are from the lowest percentile of income group, usually the majority of the expenditure will be on food, and another one is on transportation. Of course, we see GST. We are also seeing the increase in the cost of living, most notably in the cost of transportation. You see the increase in the hike in toll and the hike in the LRT services, and not including the taxi fare as well. Overall, do you see that with the budget 2016 is able to address cost of living effectively?
I think the budget at this time is probably not, a useful instrument to deal with those issues. I mean, what we have is a situation where the government is faced with trying to pump prime the economy when global economic conditions are slowing, while at the same time, for a number of reasons, the ringgit, the currency, has had a massive devaluation, and this will sooner or later feed into prices of traded goods first, but then non-traded goods will also respond to some extent. We haven't seen the full impact pass through yet to prices, but that will eventually happen. The only moderating influence here on the cost of living and inflation is the drop in fuel costs and oil prices, which actually feeds into a lot of things indirectly. All our industrial goods and even many of the consumption goods. So that will offset part of the impact of devaluation. But overall, I think we'll see inflation rising rather than falling, unfortunately. So not good for the cost of living, especially for the lower income groups.
Currently, what kind of economic indicator that we are facing right now? Negative economic indicators.
Sorry, can you say that again?
Currently, what are the economic...
Right, currently, yeah. Sure. I guess if you're looking at the challenges for Malaysia right now, it's on a program to try and sustain economic growth going forward. So the government has, revised down its growth rate from down to 4.5% to 5.5%, right? So this is a step, quite a steeping decrease in the revision, but it could be a lot lower as things unfold. Apart from that, I guess we've got a budget deficit that's expected to narrow to 3.1% of GDP. That is a bit ambitious in my view. I find it difficult to see how the government is going to be able to really narrow the deficit when it's increasing spending and it's actually looking at a slowing overall growth rate. So unless it's a big boost from the GST, this is unlikely, I think. The current account surplus is also expected to narrow. It's almost getting down to balance now. So this is a reflection of how I guess exports might slow going forward. What I find, a bit more difficult to square the circle is some of the government's expectations about investment, private investment in particular. They are forecasting a growth rate of about 7% in private investment, and this is hard to imagine right now. I know that they're planning a large spending program through the GLCs, and the GLCs investments actually get counted as private investment when it probably shouldn't be. But even then, the kind of expectations for increased FDI and private investment seems a little bit unrealistic, a little bit too high. This is also true in the 11th Malaysia Plan, and I fear that all of this might not be fully realized, and therefore growth itself might be a lot lower than the government is projecting.
I see. Interesting. We will continue the discussion after this break.
Monday Morning Matters.
Perspectives
From Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene and you're back with me on DurianASEAN. And of course with JMenon, the lead economist of trade and regional cooperation with the Asian Development Bank. Continuing our discussion on Malaysia's economic spiral, in one of the articles that you wrote, you mentioned that there's a massive layoff that is happening right now in the banking industry, which is actually a sign of a slowing regional economy. talking about the health of this region's economy, especially with the upcoming establishment of the ASEAN Economic Community. Would this sign of a slowing regional economy affect the region's economic ambition?
I think certainly it's bad timing as we try and establish the ASEAN Economic Community and all the reforms that are involved. Reforms are most easily implemented during good times rather than slowing or bad times. So that's not a very lucky set of events. But the slowdown, the layoffs you mentioned, reflect partly this growth slowdown in the region. But there's also, ongoing restructuring in the financial sector, where a combination of technological change and other sort of cost factors are driving this sort of more lean labor force in this industry. So there are. So
what you're saying is the banking industry in this region are facing metamorphosis, sort of evaluating itself, how it can somehow fit into the future of banking rather than the slow growth of the region economy.
That's right. What I'm saying is there's a bit of both happening, right?
I see.
So there's restructuring going on to make them more efficient. I mean, financial services is probably the most competitive sector of any sector, right? You have to be globally competitive going forward, especially when you start opening up to competition at home, as the AEC and other sort of arrangements are trying to do. So you have to be cost efficient, and these are adjustments to try and improve competitiveness, as well as this slowdown coming on top of that. So both factors are operating, I think.
Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned about a lot of the foreign investors are getting out of Malaysia, and they are not seeing Malaysia as an attractive investment spot. How would this actually affect Malaysia, especially Malaysia's ambition to be a hub, a financial hub in this region?
Right. So Malaysia, since 2006, has been a net exporter of capital. So there's been more FDI leaving the country than coming into the country, right? And that trend has never been reversed. We saw uptick in foreign investment a few years ago, number of factors for that, but FDI has never really come back to the levels we had before the Asian financial crisis. Mm-hmm. So there's been a trend change, a trend decline in FDI. There's also been a lot of capital flight. These things are difficult to measure because of the nature of the beast. These are often not reported officially, but the groups that have worked with the IMF in the past have come out to try to measure this, and Malaysia is up there almost at the top of the list when it comes to capital flight. So both portfolio and FDI investment seems to be leaving the country, and we need to try and reverse or stem that trend. And I think until domestic policy changes are put in place that improve the investment climate at home, and encourage foreign investors to come back and invest in these industries again, that trend was probably going to continue.
Mm-hmm. But how can the government actually repair investors' confidence when it is facing so much political backlash, especially on the issue of 1MDB?
Right. So I think there are two different things here. One is, the domestic politics, which is sending a negative signal, as you correctly point out, to everyone, including foreign investors, right? Second is the reform momentum, right? Now, there was build-up in reform momentum a few years ago with the new economic model and the 10th Malaysia Plan and everything else that was linked up with it. That seems to have slowed and in some cases come to a halt. That's very unfortunate. There was also an explicit program to divest from government-linked corporations. So this was government set targets to actually reduce the role of GLCs in the domestic economy. But unfortunately, again, while there's been some divestment, there's been new investments in new sectors. So it's become more a program of diversification than divestment of GLCs. And it's these sorts of reform fatigue setting in, I think that's preventing a return of foreign investors.
Anyway, we'll take another one short break. When we return, we'll discuss further on Malaysia's economy.
Monday Morning Matters.
Perspectives
From Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene. You're back again with me and also with JMenon, the lead economist, trade and regional cooperation with the Asian Development Bank, as we continue our discussion on the Malaysia's economy. Focusing on this time the manufacturing sector, you co-wrote a really interesting research regarding on the structural regression of Malaysia's manufacturing sector, and why this is happening and why you're highlighting it only now.
Okay, so the paper you mentioned, me and my colleague Bernard Ng at ADB, what we did was we studied the latest manufacturing survey that came out end of last year, and what we were surprised to find was that within manufacturing, electronics was no longer the biggest subsector where it was for a long time. Now it turns out that the biggest is oil refining, and the second actually is oil palm processing. So electronics now comes third on the list, and so
only for the last 5 years where it came third, or since when?
Okay, so this survey actually covers the period up to 2012. Yeah, so that's the latest data that's currently available from the survey, right? And from then on, I think there hasn't been that much of a change that's observable. You've seen, again, like in the finance sector, even in electronics, some restructuring and some sort of departure of foreign firms. So I suspect that not much has changed in terms of what's happened between 2012 and now. But that's the latest data that's available from the survey. And so the point is, why should we care about these sorts of structural changes, right? Normally it wouldn't be an issue, except that in these sectors, oil refining and oil palm processing, these are highly capital intensive sectors. So the employment opportunities are quite limited. And on top of that, the kinds of jobs that seem to be available, and this is all reported by the manufacturing survey, the kinds of jobs are not really high-paying jobs. In fact, they're quite low-paying jobs. Machine operators and so on are not. These are not good jobs with good wages. So, whereas in even electronics, it wasn't high value-added activities. As we know, Malaysia failed to properly upgrade and move up the value chain, but still there were more jobs and better paying jobs in electronics. So in that sense, this is a regression, where we are going back, as we did at the early post-colonial phase, to processing our raw material and commodities.
So we are going back. we are going back to the 70s where the government first introduced factories and machineries and people are just laborers to work under these factories.
Yes, that seems to be what's going on within manufacturing. That's right, yeah. Now, of course, Malaysia aspires to be a high-income country by 2020, as you know, with the Vision 2020. And so it wants to have a higher share of services, high-quality services, but that is still something we haven't fully realized yet. But the fact that the manufacturing sector is getting smaller, and within manufacturing, we are moving towards primary processing again. Both these are bad signs, I think, for a country aspiring to high income status.
But why Malaysia is facing this situation in the first place?
Okay.
When you mentioned about structural regression, what are the areas that Malaysia failed?
Okay, so normally, this is what Teddy Roderick has referred to as premature deindustrialization, right? So there is this whole field of study of countries that are going through this phase. And usually it's a result of exogenous or external factors like technological change, right? Or globalization or things of that sort. In Malaysia, it appears to be more policy driven, right? Again, because of the reversal in the trend of foreign investment and, the contraction of electronics. Now, of course, commodity processing has become more favorable because Malaysia has now invested more of its resources in these production of these commodities, oil palm and oil, right? And it's cheaper, of course, to do the processing close to where these things are actually produced, so you save on transport costs. But there's two factors. One is actually what's stopping the growth of other types of manufacturing, right, such as upgrading in electronics, and second, what's actually pushing us towards these sorts of commodity processing. For the first, I think, again, the policy environment is not attractive any longer to compete with other countries to attract investments in, say, electronics.
And all the electronics sectors, they are moving towards country like Vietnam, I suppose, or the CLMB countries?
That's right. So Vietnam has had rapid growth in its investments in these sectors, and now, for the first time, countries like Cambodia and Laos are also receiving that kind of investment. And Myanmar, I'm sure, as it opens up, will also be competing for those sorts of investments.
With your research, does it show that Malaysia is no longer looking at manufacturing as part of its economic GDP? With the 11 Malaysia plan, does Malaysia actually have a plan for it?
I think Malaysia sees the role for manufacturing to continue. It can't be, it's too soon now to move too heavily into services. It's focusing on services, but not without manufacturing. The problem here is manufacturing is contracting while agriculture is growing. Right? So it's not like if manufacturing contracts because services, high quality services are growing, then that's a natural sort of transformation towards, an industrialized economy, right? A high income economy. But here, services are increasing a little bit, but it's agriculture that's taking up the space that's given up by the contraction in manufacturing.
And how would sorry.
No, go on.
Yeah, I mean, what I meant is how would actually all these somehow affect the Malaysia's economy in the coming years?
Well, I think the problem with all of this is that this kind of standard of living that we hope for as a high-income country may not be realized by the majority of its people, right? Now, getting to to the threshold, the cutoff point for high income, might happen by 2020, but we could be like Saudi Arabia, right? Saudi Arabia is a high-income country, but you don't see that when you go there, right? Yeah. It's not really, the kind of, you don't have the same services, the institutions, and the same sort of governance structures that you expect from an advanced or high-income country. And in Malaysia, there's growing, I think, inequality. That's a lot of it's not easy to measure properly, but underlying growing inequality that is driving us towards high income status. So it's not a very inclusive type of growth, and this regression in manufacturing is one example of that process that's taking place, of this growing gaps within the different parts of the population.
Talking about growing gaps, Malaysia is also trying to grow its reach towards in terms of trying to get more of the world's economic pie by joining quite a number of FTAs, and of course the most famous one or infamous one will be the TPPA, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Do you think it's too soon for Malaysia to say yes for the TPP?
I think, we're waiting to see what happens with the negotiated text. I believe it might be out within a week now, a week or so. And we have to see what Malaysia has really committed itself to, right? As you know, the trade minister in Malaysia has come out publicly and said that Malaysia has a lot of carve-outs and exemptions, longer transition periods for the most sensitive sectors like government procurement, SOEs, and those sorts of reforms. So in that sense, maybe this won't be very difficult for Malaysia to implement, because the hardest things have been sort of, quarantined. So we'll have to wait and see. But the problem with that is that most of the benefits that come from these sorts of agreements come from making reforms in these sensitive areas. Everyone talks about improved market access. That's only one small part of the whole agreement. The real benefits come when you can use these agreements to implement difficult reforms at home, right? And Malaysia seems to have missed that opportunity by trying to, carve out these important domestic reforms.
I see. So at the end of the day, how would all this, the whole different areas of changes that Malaysia is facing right now, and especially with the new plan of trying to look forward towards the 11 Malaysia plan, would Malaysia's economy be healthier next year?
Okay, it's a bit difficult to say right now. Yeah, there's so many unknowns and so many things that are unclear, not just internationally, but even domestically, right? We hope that, things will be better, but if you're going to balance out all the existing information and risk, unfortunately, I think you are more likely to expect things getting worse rather than better right now.
Or another Saudi Arabia, I suppose.
Well, I think the whole policy settings and the opportunity to, make important changes in the reform area seems to have been lost. I think that's the saddest part of all of this. Usually faced with, a crisis type situation, governments in the past have been very pragmatic, right? But they haven't faced the same kind of political sort of uncertainties that the current administration is facing. So maybe that's a difference. But in the past, when faced with difficult economic conditions, the governments have been very pragmatic in implementing reforms. But this time, you can't seem to see that happening. So this is why it's hard to be optimistic. But if the international economic environment does improve, isn't as negative as we currently expect, that could be an important sort of buffer for Malaysia. But domestically, I can't see that the government is doing enough to help improve those sorts of prospects.
With that, thank you very much.
Thank you also. Good to talk to you again, Ali.